Hello, everybody, and welcome to the NBA Trade Zone podcast, where we talk all things NBA trades, past, present, future. Hi, guys. My name is Daniel.
And I am Sebastian, and today we're going to take a historical look back at a trade that involved a lot of players that Danny over here feels like none of the teams actually won this trade. All teams came out bad. And the trade we're going to talk about is the famous trade that Dwight Howard was sent to the Lakers in 2012.
Yeah, and what a horrible trade this was for every team involved. So, it was essentially the main pieces moving were Andre Iguodala to the Nuggets, Dwight Howard went to the Lakers, Andrew Bynum went to the Sixers, and Philadelphia received Andrew Bynum, but the fourth team involved was the Magic, and the Magic received a bunch of young players and a bunch of picks, and we will review what every team received individually, whatever team traded away, whatever team received, how it impacted them, and then I will throw out a scenario of a trade that would have made much more sense at the time for each of the teams making the trade, and then I will ask Sebastian to review how he feels that player would fit on that team, and then how each team would have panned out had they made that trade. So without further ado, we're gonna start off with the 76ers. So this trade took place on August 10, 2012, and the 76ers were coming off a 35-31 season in 2011-2012. They had a very young, talented roster. They had Thaddeus Young, who was 23, Drew Holiday, 21, Evan Turner, 23, who had just been the second overall pick in 2010. Nikola Vucevic was 21. He had been the 16th pick in 2011. Lou Williams, 25. Jody Meeks, 24. Spencer Howells was 23. And Lavoy Allen was 22. And now the reason why I'm naming all these players is because this was a second-round playoff team, and they had lost to the Celtics in 7 games that year. So Andre Iguodala was their one All-Star. He was 28 at the time and coming off his one and only All-Star appearance. He had averaged some very good numbers, put up about 12 points a game, just around 5.5 assists, 5.5 rebounds, and obviously was a great defensive player like he still is. And the 76ers decided to trade Andre Iguodala, Mo Harkless, who had been the 15th pick in that year, and Nikola Vucevic, who, like I just stated, had been the 16th pick in 2011, which was the year before, and a 2017 first-round draft pick, which was about 5 years down the line. De'Aaron Fox was selected with this pick with the number 5 pick. And the reason why this pick is important, too, is because it's a first-round pick that's really 5 years from that time, making it really an unknown pick. Nobody knew how high or how low this pick would have been, and it ended up being a very high pick. So the 76ers received Andrew Bynum and Jason Richardson, who was essentially a felon at this time. And this really speaks to how high the 76ers were on Andrew Bynum and how high the rest of the league really was on Andrew Bynum. Because he essentially was worth 3 first-round picks and an all-star in the prime of his career. Bynum was 24 at the time, coming off a couple championships with the Lakers in previous years. He had put up some real good numbers, and had a lot of potential and was really seen as a cornerstone center who the 76ers were hoping would have been that cornerstone center for them and really joined the remainder of that young roster to build a team for years to come. Now, he didn't even play one game for the 76ers. His injuries really started piling up and never ended up playing one game for the Sixers. His desire was never there after that. So an alternative trade that would have made sense at this time for the Philadelphia 76ers would have been the same package, so Iguodala, Harkless, Vucevic, and the 2017 first for Paul George. Now, The Pacers were coming off a 42-24 season in which they lost to the Heat, and this was LeBron James and Chris Bosh's first year with the Heat. They lost to the Heat in the semifinals in 6 games. So you can see they put up a real fight against the Heat. This was against the best team in the league, essentially. So they really could have used an all-star and a couple of young players. They had David West, Dwight Howard at the time, and they really could have used another all-star who would have helped the team out. Now, Danny Granger was still with the team. This is right when his injuries began to happen, but he had still played in a majority of the regular season for the Pacers at this time. And it wasn't really, nobody knew how lingering his injury would have been. Now, Paul George played 66 games that year, averaged 12 points, 5.5 rebounds, 2.5 assists, and a steal and a half. Made about 1.5 3-pointers on 38% shooting. So had a very solid season. Was 22 years old, but had not become the Paul George we all know today at this point yet. So Indiana probably would have been willing to make this trade, but what do you think? Do you think Indiana would have been willing to make this trade, and how do you think they would have performed in 2012 and 2013 and a couple years after that?
Well, it was 2012 and 2013 the year that Danny Granger gets injured and he stops performing well, or does he have one more?
He did stop. He did not play a lot in this season, no.
Well, then obviously, in hindsight, looking back, right, if you're Pacers, you would never do this trade. But at the time, you have Danny Granger, who's your 3, who's, putting up all-star numbers at the time. I remember watching Danny Granger and thinking he was really good. So if you're the Pacers, you do this pick. I actually think at this time, I think that in this trade that you don't even have to include the 2017 first-round pick if you're the 76ers because you are giving up Iguodala. Iguodala has played well against, even up to this point, one of the better defenders against LeBron. So that's the person you got to beat. So you take him on. You're still getting Mo Harkless and Vucevic, who at the time, Vucevic was a center. Centers were more valued at the time. So I think when it comes to the assets you're getting back for Paul George, who hasn't proven too much yet. I mean, maybe the Pacers seeing him more than, since they've been working with him, they see more potential with him than others. But this is a trade that you make at a time if you're in a win-now mode.
Yes, exactly, and I should have prefaced that before. But yes, all these trades will look ridiculous in hindsight. But the point over here I'm trying to make is that a lot of these teams, all these teams involved, could have had made much better decisions at the time, and essentially throwing out alternative routes on what decisions they could have made, and what trades would have looked much better for them had they made these decisions. Because I really feel like none of these teams won this trade, and all of these teams lost pretty badly. I mean, we know what happened to the Philadelphia 76ers. Essentially, the next year, even though Drew Holiday became an all-star, and they had that extremely young team, they decided to completely rebuild for the next 3 to 4 years, and it really ruined the franchise for a handful of years. Obviously, now they're in a real good position, but we're looking back at how they could have just flowed through and continued on with their winning ways, essentially.
Yes, and then of course when you think about it, you don't want to get Andrew Bynum, so obviously at the time you can understand why the 76ers took on Bynum, coming off those few championships, him being young. But obviously getting Paul George in return would have been a better option.
Yeah, and I don't think anyone's saying that his just desire at this point still was not there. I mean, he was still playing a lot for the Lakers, playing in a majority of the games throughout the seasons, and really nobody knew that his desire would become what it became, and that he wouldn't play at least one game for the 76ers. So, moving on, now we're going to move on to the Nuggets. Who they received and who they traded away. So, the Nuggets traded away Aaron Aflalo, Al Harrington, their own 2014 first-round pick, and their own 2013 second-round pick. and they received Andre Iguodala in this trade. Now, the Nuggets were coming off a 38-28 season in which they lost in the first round in the playoffs. Aflalo had averaged about 15 points a game on 1.5 3-pointers on 40% shooting, which is good. The rest of his numbers weren't that good, but he was your prototypical 3-and-D guy at the time, was only 27 years old. Al Harrington had averaged 14 points, 6 rebounds, and a steal a game on similar numbers in terms of 3-pointers, about a 3.5 a game on 33% shooting, so he didn't have that good of a shooting numbers. But this was the Nuggets team that had a very deep roster and a lot of good players and no great players, and they needed an all-star. They needed someone to really take over their team and lead their team. Therefore, they traded it for Andre Iguodala. Again, this is the 28-year-old who was just coming off his all-star year. So he did have a real good year for them in 2012-2013. He played 18 games, put up 13 points a game, about 5 rebounds, 5 assists, and 1.7 steals for the Nuggets. The Nuggets did end up winning 57 games. However, they did lose in the first round of the playoffs to the Warriors in 6 games. And Andre Iguodala, right after that, signed with the Warriors for 4 years and $48 million, essentially playing just 1 year for the team he was traded to, and then Nuggets received nothing for him in return, so they essentially lost out on a first-round pick and 2 quality rotation players for nothing after 1 year, as they were pounced in the first round of the playoffs. So an alternative trade that could have been made, this package, could have been Aflalo, Harrington, their first-round pick in 2014, and their second-round pick in 2013 for Paul Millsap. Now, Paul Millsap was 27 years old at the time of this trade, coming off a season in which he averaged 17 points a game, 19 rebounds, 2 assists, and nearly 2 steals and nearly 1 block for the Utah Jazz. Now, Millsap and Al Jefferson were both 27, 28 at the time. However, Utah had Derek Favors, who they had just traded from the Brooklyn Nets, and Enes Kanter, who was 22, and Derek Favors was 21. And it was essentially known at the time that Millsap and Jefferson were playing on borrowed time because of the fact that Favors and Kanter were eventually going to take over their spots in the rotation, which ended up happening. Both players left in 2013, which was a year later, due to the fact that they knew their time in Utah. They weren't going to play as much as they wanted in Utah. So Millsap ended up leaving to the Hawks, and for the next 4 seasons, averaged 17 points, 8 rebounds, 3 assists, 1 block, and a steal and a half per game, and essentially appeared in 4 All-Star games. Now, it would have made much more sense for Utah to make this trade because of the fact that they would have received a few things in return. Now, Al Harrington could have played power forward for them, essentially a holdover year, allow Derek Favors to develop still another year, and Aaron Aflalo could have been a nice starting shooting guard for them. They did have a young Gordon Hayward, who was playing a little more of small forward at the time, so he would have been a perfect fit for the Utah Jazz at this time and really could have continued to help them flow through and develop into a very good team. So how do you feel that Aaron Aflalo let's go with, how do you feel Paul Millsap would have made sense for the Nuggets at this time?
Yeah, Paul Millsap is, I think overall he brings more to the table than Aflalo and Harrington combined. I value him, especially at this time when he's, coming into the prime of his career where he's averaging 17 points, 9 rebounds. He's a good defensive player. So I feel like this would be a improvement for the Nuggets at the power forward position. And overall, he's just a good player, and he would help the Nuggets improve. When it comes to the Jazz, you're getting something in return. I'm not sure how much if Paul Millsap is leaving at this time, but just to get at least that Denver Nuggets pick in return, that would be helpful to you. This wasn't an era where this player movement was that big yet, so, obviously it occurred, but it wasn't as publicized out there.
Actually, this one was. They essentially, at the time, they knew that Al Jefferson and Paul Millsap were essentially playing on borrowed time.